Hey, 42 here. If Hollywood is to be believed, almost all spies have a few things in common. They're good looking, they drive curiously expensive cars for public sector workers, they have access to more high-tech gadgets than Marcus Brownlee, and most importantly of all, they have bollocks so big they could use them as medicine balls. And I don't just mean that figuratively. With a few notable exceptions, every spy in Hollywood history was male. The subject of today's video bucks most of those trends quite spectacularly. While she was famous for her looks, as far as I'm aware, she didn't own a single laser watch and she drove no luxurious cars. And whilst her metaphorical balls were bigger than the Rock of Gibraltar, her literal ones were nowhere to be seen, and we always research thoroughly on this channel. Her name was Mata Hari, and as well as being one of the most notorious double agents the world of espionage has ever seen, she also happened to be the most famous erotic dancer in history, until the Trollolol Man debuted online in 2009. After spying for both sides in the First World War, she would ultimately face a French firing squad after her duplicitous dealings led to the deaths of 50,000 Allied soldiers. Or did they? History remembers Mata Hari as the ultimate femme fatale, a seductress who played with fire and got burnt. Well, shot, but you get the point. But some people believe she was nothing more than a scapegoat used by the French government to focus attention away from the failings at the front. As it turns out, the truth is much more interesting. Mata Hari was born in the Netherlands in 1876 as Margarethe Zeller. The daughter of a successful hat maker and the eldest of 4 children, she lived a comfortable existence until the age of 13, when she unexpectedly drew a ticket in the lottery of life so bad, a seagull would refuse to shit on it. In the space of just 2 years, her father went bankrupt, her parents divorced, and her mother died. She was sent to live with various relatives, and at 15, began studying to be a kindergarten teacher. In later life, she would become one of the greatest sex symbols on the planet, but even in those days, she was turning heads faster than a chiropractor. And she was forced to leave the school after having an affair with the head teacher. All in all, Margarethe's life wasn't turning out quite the way she'd hoped, so she set about trying to change it. And the opportunity to do just that soon showed up in the back pages of the local paper. Captain Rudolph McLeod sounded like a Star Trek reject, but was in fact a wealthy officer in the Dutch colonial army stationed in Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies, and he was looking for a wife. Tinder not having been invented yet, he decided the best way to try and find one was by placing an advert in the paper whilst on leave back home, hoping some lucky lass would swipe right across its broadsheets. Margarethe promptly responded, including the one thing sure to land her the job: a photo of herself. The captain liked what he saw in her 19th century sext, and after a long romantic courtship that lasted a whole 6 days, the happy couple married in Amsterdam before setting sail for the East Indies. But there was soon trouble in paradise, because it turned out that, as well as being a wealthy and respected army officer, Rudolph was also a violent alcoholic who kept a live-in lover. Didn't put that in your ad, did you, Rudolph? Despite the fact that he was a raging, philandering drunk arsewipe, the couple had 2 children, Norman and Louise. But eventually, Rudolph's behaviour became too much for Margarethe to bear, and she left him to live with another army officer. It was around this time she joined a local dance troupe and took the stage name of Mata Hari, meaning Eye of the Dawn in the local dialect. She had no way of knowing it then, but the moniker would soon be world famous. Margarethe and Rudolph briefly reconciled, but things went from bad to absolutely bloody horrific when their son Norman passed away in unusual circumstances in 1899. The couple claimed one of the servants poisoned him, but most historians believe Norman died from syphilis he contracted from his parents. After the death of their son, they returned to Amsterdam, but their marriage, which hadn't exactly been a modern retelling of Romeo and Juliet to begin with, was officially over. Like the true gentleman that he was, Rudolph refused to pay child support, and just to make sure history would remember him as a solid gold bastard, he took out an advert in the local paper politely requesting that the entire community treat his wife like an exile. Yeah. Anyway, despite him having the paternal instincts of a vulture on day-old roadkill, Louise decided to live with her dad, and for the second time in her life, Margarita found herself with absolutely nothing. But once again, she somehow found the strength to reinvent herself, only this time the consequences would be even more explosive. Paris in the early 1900s was one of the most exciting cities in the world. This was the so-called Belle Époque, the beautiful era, when, if you had talent and ambition, anything was possible. Being prepared to take your clothes off helped too. This was the heyday of the Moulin Rouge after all. Margarita arrived in the city in 1903, and after a brief stint as a circus horse rider, she took to the stage as Mata Hari. Her style of dance and overall aesthetic drew heavily on her time in Southeast Asia, and she constructed a backstory to match. No fool when it came to building her brand, rather than telling her adoring fans that she came from a middle-class family in the Netherlands, she concocted an elaborate tale in which she was an Indonesian princess who'd been learning the sacred art of Indian dance since she was a child. Little was known of the Dutch East Indies at the time, and it wasn't as if people could just Google it. This was so long ago you couldn't even ask Jeeves, unless you had an actual butler. So all of Paris swallowed Mata's story like it was a well-aged Bordeaux. I'm sure the fact that she was half naked whilst telling it helped tremendously. Along with her newfound fame, Mata acquired a string of rich and powerful lovers, from masters of industry to high-ranking officers and politicians. For almost a decade, she was the darling of the press and not-so-polite society. But by 1912, her career was on the wane, and she was arguably better known for the work she did lying down rather than standing up. She performed her last show in 1915 before effortlessly transitioning from high-class stripper to even higher-class escort, traveling throughout Europe alongside some of the most powerful men of the day. This kind of sex without borders would have been fine under normal circumstances, but circumstances in Europe were anything but normal. Still, not even the outbreak of the First World War could derail Mata Hari's transcontinental bonathon. The Netherlands remained neutral during the conflict, and as a Dutch citizen, she could still go wherever she liked and with whomever she pleased. In a break from her usual pattern of sleeping with men older than a good Stilton, she began a passionate affair with Captain Vadim Maslov, a dashing young Russian pilot who was fighting alongside the French. In 1916, he was shot down and so badly injured in the crash that he lost sight in his left eye. He was taken to a hospital near the Western Front, and when Mata Hari asked permission to visit him, she was told that she could do so on one condition. The French wanted her to become a spy. To begin with, that might sound like a left-field call. She had absolutely zero relevant qualifications and had spent the previous 10 years shaking her bits and tits in front of tens of thousands of people, then selling them to the highest bidder. Not exactly covert. But when you think about it, it was a stroke of genius. Here was a woman who had extremely intimate access to Europe's high and mighty, many of whom came from the military or politics. As far as the French were concerned, she was a guided missile who could be relied upon to strike the heart of any high-level target in Europe, provided said target had a penis. And this was 1916, so that was basically all of them. And so, Mata Hari became a French intelligence asset, practicing what I'm going to call horizontal diplomacy. She was thrown in right at the deep end too. Her first target was some bloke called Crown Prince Wilhelm, elder son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of Germany. Wilhelm Jr. had seen Mata Hari dance before the war, and the idea was that she would catch him in a honey trap before taking him somewhere private and vigorously pumping him for information. If successful, she would be paid 1 million francs, as the French believed Little Willie was a senior general with access to all kinds of secrets that could help swing the war in their favor. On the face of it, this salacious scheme made perfect sense. The most famous courtesan in the world charms one of Germany's military titans into bed, and in between playing hide the bratwurst, finds out all she can to help La République. Unfortunately, there were two major flaws. The first was that the prince was about as far away from being a war hero as Mata Hari was from being a nun. The German propaganda machine had painted him as a mighty warrior who was key to the war effort, but in reality, Little Willie was a big dick. He was a drinker and womanizer, and he spent more time scheming to depose his own father than he ever did on eliminating Germany's enemies. Still, Mata Hari had bigger things to worry about than her target not having any information worth stealing. Because not long after the French enlisted her as a sex spy, she met the aptly named Karl Kremer, German consul in the Netherlands. He offered her 20,000 francs to become a double agent and spy for Germany, and she promptly accepted. So, as far as both sides were concerned, Mata Hari was working for them. You don't need to be a genius to know that, like most threesomes, someone was going to get shafted. Towards the end of 1916, Mata Hari travelled to Madrid, where she seduced Major Arnold Kaller, German military attaché to Spain. She managed to get some information from him, but nothing her French handlers considered to be worth the large sum of money they'd promised her. In January 1917, Major Kaller sent a series of communiques to Berlin, detailing the stellar work of a German spy codenamed Agent H21. From his description, it would have been obvious to anyone listening that H21 was Mata Hari. And as it turned out, people were listening. The French intercepted the messages, and decoding them proved easy, as they were in a code that had long been broken. But here's the thing, the Germans knew that code had been broken. So nobody knows for sure why the messages were sent in that code, but it's widely believed the Germans suspected Mata Hari was working for the French, and they deliberately lied about her being a German spy in easily interceptable communications as a clever way of eliminating her. If that was indeed their plan, it worked perfectly. On the 13th of February 1917, French agents burst into Mata Hari's hotel room on the Champs-Élysées. She was arrested and her luxurious surroundings replaced by a rat-infested jail cell in Saint-Lazare prison. Her trial began on the 24th of July, and from the start, there was only going to be one verdict. The prosecutor was Captain Pierre Bouchardon, better known as the Grand Inquisitor, for his, shall we say, enthusiastic interrogation tactics. He didn't have a hard time convincing the jury that Mata Hari was a double agent and born liar. After all, she'd fabricated every iota of her life, from her background to her name. He would have had a harder job accusing a fish of swimming. The trial was also a complete sham. The French fabricated evidence against her, and her defense lawyer wasn't even allowed to cross-examine the witnesses. In desperation, Mata Hari contacted the Dutch embassy in Paris and asked for help, but they flatly refused. She even reached out to her great love, Captain Maslov, to see if he would testify on her behalf, but again, no dice. Abandoned by everyone in her hour of need, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Just before dawn on the 15th of October 1917, she stepped out in front of a French firing squad. Numerous legends have emerged about her final moments. Some say she went to die dressed in an immaculately tailored suit she'd had commissioned for the occasion. Others that she refused a blindfold so she could look the soldiers in the eye as they pulled their triggers. Apparently, she even blew them a kiss just before they fired. For years after her death, Mata Hari was a symbol of sordid sexuality, the temptress who got caught in a web of her own lies and paid the ultimate price. But as with everything in her life, the truth is far fuzzier. In 1917, things were looking bleak for France. Soldiers were being slaughtered in vast numbers, many at the front were mutinying, and the already fragile economy was further crippled by a wave of strikes. Mata Hari became the perfect scapegoat for the nation's woes, a sort of seductive Eve in the garden of French despair. She was the ideal fall girl, a known personality that the media could drool over, and a foreigner to boot, two for the price of one. It was widely reported at the time that she had confessed to being a German spy, but in reality she maintained her innocence until the very end. She did admit to having taken money from Karl Kremer, but here's the thing. She only met that guy in the first place in an attempt to get close to the Crown Prince. Taking the money and convincing the Germans she was on their side would have been a good way of doing that. Whatever the truth, one thing's for sure. The case against her was as flimsy as a wet tissue. In the years after the trial, the deputy prosecutor admitted that there wasn't enough evidence to whip a cat, let alone have a woman shot. It seems that rather than the ultimate double agent, Mata Hari might very well have been a scapegoat. Or should that be a sacrificial lamb, who was punished most of all for living life on her own terms. For a decade in the early 20th century, she was arguably the most desired woman on planet Earth. But after her execution, nobody wanted anything to do with her, except perhaps for the necrophiliacs. Sorry. None of her surviving family ever came forward to claim her remains, so instead, they were released for medical research. Her embalmed body was kept at the Museum of Anatomy in Paris for 80 years, before a routine inspection uncovered something rather bizarre. Someone had stolen her mummified head. To this day, it has never been recovered. It seems that even in death, something about Mata Hari was simply irresistible. Thanks for watching.